The War for Mansoul by John Bunyan, as told by Ethel Barrett. Copyright 1998, Christian Light Publications Incorporated, Harrisonburg, Virginia. Confidence and Beyond. Watch and pray, the prince had said. There are diabolans still here. Do not deceive yourselves. Well, no, the last thing they wanted to do was deceive themselves, spoil all this happiness and prosperity. But it was difficult to know, for, quite frankly, there were such inconsistencies, and man's soul was so mixed up by nature that sometimes it was difficult to tell who was a real enemy and who was not. Mr. Colonel Security hurried out of his house and started up the street. He was a very well-dressed gentleman, a little on the portly side, with the florid face and commodious stomach of the self-indulgent and the liberal-minded. He walked with a quick, sure stride, his head high and confident, and he had an aura of success and prosperity about him that made those who met him on the street nod their heads in deference, and all who knew him socially or in business treated him with a certain awe. He was highly conceited, but at the same time very charming and winsome, two diverse traits that somehow seemed to live together comfortably within him. He walked to the market square and began to cross it, calling out jovially to those about their day's business. He was an imposing and important figure, fearless and sure of himself. Indeed, he came by these traits quite naturally, for long ago, when Diabolus had first taken possession of the town of Mansoul, he brought with him a great number of diabolans. That dread day when he had called out, "Go in quietly," it was not only the warlords and officers and soldiers that had swarmed in, but a host of diabolans who had also invaded and had been quartered throughout the town. They had not only married among themselves and bred, but intermarried with Mansoulians and produced half-breeds, and the weird combinations of these offspring were legion. Among those who had swarmed in that dreadful day, there was one whose name was Mr. Self-Conceit, and he was as notable and brisk a man as any who possessed man's soul in those days. Diabolus, with his keen eye for perceiving sharp recruits to do his work, had noticed this chap almost at once, and had given him jobs of greater and greater importance. These jobs he executed with greater efficiency than any from the deepest dens could have done, and he'd risen in the ranks until he was placed in a position next to Lord Wilby-Will himself. Naturally, Wilby-Will had been quite pleased with Self-Conceit in those days. It was only a matter of time before the young upstart was courting Will's daughter, Lady Fear-Nothing. Everybody had been agreeable to the match, including Lady Fear-Nothing herself, and in due time they were married. Baby Colonel Security had been the result of this match. Colonel Security had grown in stature and craft, and had learned his tricks from those in authority over him, both by inheritance and example. He took after both his father and his mother. He was self-conceited, he feared nothing, but he had picked up a few other tricks besides. He learned, for one thing, to spurn the weak and align himself with the strong, and to shift sides if it were expedient. So, although he was a great doer for Diabolus during the rebellion by encouraging Mansoul to resist the king's forces, when he saw that the town was taken and converted to the use of the glorious Prince Mansoul and Diabolus was rousted out with contempt and scorn, he slyly wheeled about, and, as he had served Diabolus against the prince, he now feigned to serve the prince against Diabolus. He had done very well, too. There was no news, no doctrine, no talk of altercation afoot but that Mr. Colonel Security would make the head or tail of it. He made it his business to acquire a smattering of the things of Emmanuel, caught them by the tail, so to speak, and armed with this, he ventured into the company of the townsmen and chatted with them and picked up various concoctions, connections, and friendships. He was, to be vulgar, a backslapper. He said things people wanted to hear. He spoke in glowing terms of the power and strength of Mansoul. He chatted amiably with the clubs of its fortifications and weapons. He flattered lavishly the captains and officers at their many luncheons. "Yes, sir," he was wont to say, "you are certainly going places. Impregnable. Nothing can trip you up now. Nothing." All of which made him the most delightful company, and the townsmen were tickled and quite taken with his discourses. And so they went, from talking to feasting, and from feasting to sporting, until at last Mansell was dancing after his pipe and growing almost as carnally secure as himself. On this particular morning he was in fine spirits. He stopped at the edge of a little park in the market square, picked a flower, and arranged it in his buttonhole. He thought of his good looks and many talents and fine position, and especially of the good impression he would make on Lord Understanding and Will-be-Will and Conscience. They were meeting for breakfast. He had, he mused, a ring in the nose of everybody who was anybody in Mansell. Things were looking good. Yes, very good indeed. Lord Will-be-Will left his house and hurried down the street. He was looking very dapper, feeling very gay, and stepping with confidence. He looked prosperous and happy, as indeed he was. Mansell was still in a golden era. Things had never been brighter. His affairs both at home and in his work were going first rate. He thought of his keen mind and his ability to make decisions and the marvelous shape he had been keeping himself in. He passed the castle, hesitated a moment, and wondered if he should go in. He was to meet his colleagues at Mr. Colonel's security for breakfast, and he was already a bit late. He consulted his timepiece briefly, frowned slightly, and hurried on. He noticed a smudge on the side of his robe, stopped, and tried to wipe it off with his sleeve, and failing, folded the material over and walked on, calling out a hearty greeting to someone who hailed him from across the street. Then he quickened his pace again. There was more elasticity in his step than ever before, and the smudge on his robe was nearly discernible. Lord Understanding hurried along the street toward the market square, where he had an appointment with Will and Conscience and Mr. Colonel's security. He was walking briskly, his feet hardly touching the ground. He radiated confidence, and no wonder, for his powers of discernment had seemed exceedingly sharp of late, in spite of the fact that he had little time to do for research. He had taken a speed rating course to help him in this area, and although he was too busy to put it into practice, he did find that it came in handy in getting to the word of Shaddai quickly. Of course, it militated against meditation on choice words and passages, but in these busy times one did what one could. At any rate, he had never seemed in better health, and the respect he commanded among his peers was flattering and gratifying. Mr. Colonel's security was a delightful chap, he thought, as he breezed past the castle without a sideward glance. It was nice to be appreciated. He continued on his way, already forming in his mind some sharp comments to make upon current topics of the day that might be brought up during the breakfast conversation. Some trash blew across his path, and he walked through it without knowing, for he was glancing upward. The sky seemed quite murky. A cloud had come over the sun. As he neared the market square, he remembered that he should have stopped in at the castle. It was too late now, he thought, and continued on his way. The sky was darker now, but he did not notice. Mr. Conscience hurried toward the market square. There was a spring in his step, and he felt remarkably clear-headed, considering that he had been up late the night before. Mr. Colonel Security's parties were fashionable and smart and stimulating, but it was hard to get up in the morning. He glanced nervously in the direction of the castle as he passed by. He knew he should stop in. There really wasn't time. He'd be late for breakfast, Mr. Colonel Security. As he hurried on, he noticed a slight pain in the region of his middle. No, it was more like a pang. He decided not to fuss or worry about it. Wasn't Mansell in better shape than had ever been? Mansell was, as Mr. Colonel Security had said so often, impregnable. Such talent, such beauty, such strength. His robe caught on a bush by the wayside and tore a bit, but he did not feel it. He hurried on. It was beginning to sprinkle. Prince Emmanuel waited for the officials of Mansell to come to his castle to partake of the love feast he had prepared for them. But they did not come. They had not come for quite some time, nor had they noticed whether or not he went to visit them. He had prepared the love feast regularly, but they had neglected them. Their delight in the feast was gone. They had stopped going to the Lord High Secretary, too, for counsel and teaching. They made their own decisions now. They did not need the prince. They no longer delighted in him quite so fully, because they delighted more in the power and the gifts he had given them. They did not wait for his love or his counsels, but were headstrong and confident in themselves, believing they were strong and invincible and secure and beyond all reach of the foe, and that this state would be unalterable forever. Twice he had sent the Lord High Secretary to warn them that they were on dangerous ground, but both times they had been at dinner in Mr. Colonel Security's parlor and did not have time to reason. Emmanuel looked at the feast and the dainties and the precious gifts, and thought of Mansoul, and bemoaned them, and condoled their state with the Lord High Secretary. "Oh, that my people had hearkened unto me, and that Mansoul had walked in my ways," he said. "I would have fed them with the finest of the wheat, and with honey out of the rock would I have sustained them." Notice. This is to serve notice that Mr. God's Peace is laying down his commission and will for the present act no longer as governor of the town of Mansoul. Breakfast grew into lunch. The company was so jolly, the conversation so stimulating. Mr. Colonel Security was indeed a delightful host. It was on the way home that Conscience and Will-be-will and Understanding saw the notice in the market square. It had blown loose from one nail. A brisk breeze had come up and a corner was flapping wildly. Conscience held it down so they could all read it. Then they looked at each other in dismay. It was disquieting news. They decided to go to the castle at once and make amends. As they neared the gate, bits of rubble and leaves from unclean streets blew across their paths. Will caught his foot in the hem of his robe at one juncture and ripped it a bit. They pinned up the tear and hurried on. At the castle gate they knocked and waited. No one came. They knocked again. Strange. The prince used to run to meet them halfway and embrace them. They knocked again. No sound, nothing. The breeze had grown into a cold wind. They grew impatient. They compared timepieces and considered their busy schedules. They decided to go on about their business. As they left, the rain came suddenly, whipping their robes about them and lashing against the castle windows. It whipped across the market square, too, in sheets, tearing at the notice of Mr. Godpeace's resignation. The notice flapped until it finally gave away and went scurrying across the empty square. It was stopped at the edge by a bush, and there it stayed, impaled on a thorn, and the cold rain soaked it through.